the picture next to that expression now. And since he really needs no introduction, I'm not going to read to you his impressive bio. Instead, I'm going to tell you a few things that you might not know. So first of all, if you've read The Coddling of the American Mind, you know that 2012 was the year that John and Greg noticed that college campuses had shifted to a culture of safetyism. But what you might not know is that that was also the end of a personal era for John, or more accurately, it was the end of an era for John's hair color. Second, you all know that John is preoccupied with questions about the moral foundations that underpin why the right and left see things differently. And you also know that he's preoccupied with how both a certain amount of adversity and a lifetime of companionate love are necessary for optimal human development and flourishing. And his wife, Jane, is here today. But what you probably don't know is the question that preoccupied John when I first became aware of him at the University of Chicago in 1993. And that question was, is it wrong to eat your dog? I'm not joking. That was how I became aware of John. Now that John is an award-winning tenured professor with an endowed position who's written best-selling books, it wouldn't be surprising for him to be an arrogant know-it-all who's not interested in the thinking of those who have less prestige. But having worked closely with him and Greg on The Coddling of the American Mind, I can tell you that the opposite is the case. And since I'm introducing John and not Greg, I'm just going to refer to him, but everything I say can also be said about Greg. During the writing process, John was always interested in hearing what other people had to say, what other people thought. He sought out a diverse set of thinkers to read drafts, including and especially people he knew would disagree with him. There were even times when I strongly disagreed with him, and when I did, John always listened generously, almost always making changes that satisfied my objections, and when he didn't, he almost always persuaded me to change my mind. He didn't have to care about my opinion, and he certainly didn't need to take the time to persuade me of anything. But if I felt strongly about something, strongly enough to raise it, then he always did. A lot of people talk about the importance of dissent and disagreement, but in practice, I think we've all seen only a small fraction of those people practice what they preach. And the best way that I can introduce John is to simply say that he does.
Wow, well, that was a really lovely introduction, and I'm not going to disagree with any part of it. So this is really exciting. I came into the room around 4:15, and you guys are all really fired up. Like, I don't know what you've been doing all day long, but apparently this is a very passionate group with concerns about what's happening in our country and some ideas, I think very good ideas, about what's the problem, what needs to change. I think what I'm going to do with I think I'm going to talk about 25, 30 minutes, and we have time for discussion, right? We have an hour. What time does the session end? I think that's about right. I definitely want to have time to talk with you about this. And so I thought, given the unusual nature of this gathering, I put together some ideas of kind of a new talk to get down for the first time some ideas that have been swirling around my head about liberalism and about what it is that brings us together today and what it is that I think is going to bring us forward to a much better future. American liberalism, I believe, is the greatest thing ever to happen to just about every identity group you can imagine. Black, white, Jewish, East Asian, South Asian, LGBTQ. And I'm going to show that with a couple of stories, and then I'll get into how things became illiberal and what we can do to get back on the amazing track that we were on. So here's the first story. So I was born in October of 1963, 2 months after Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, which means that I was born about 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And if you look at that 100 years and you ask, how much progress did America make? on issues of rights and justice in that 100 years. And of course, there was certainly some. Things were, nothing is worse than slavery, but Jim Crow was still in effect. So yeah, there was some progress, but 100 years? Pretty disappointing. Okay, so I'm born in 1963. Now let's look ahead the next 50 years, from 1963 to 2013. How much progress? And you can go decade by decade, and you can look at just about every possible group you can think of. So obviously, African American civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, we're a mile or two here from Stonewall Inn. Animal rights, environmental concerns, pretty much any social justice issue you could care about. I mean, there has never been a history, there's never been a period in human history where so many groups made so much progress on becoming full and equal citizens of any country. So this is the most, arguably the most extraordinary period in human history, the late 20th century and on into the beginning of the 21st. So put yourself back in 2013. What was the world like in 2013? Barack Obama had just been reelected. Gay marriage proposals, which had all failed in 2008, pretty much, I think all of them failed. Most of them passed in 2012. And we were 2 or 3 years shy of when the Supreme Court was going to make it the law of the land. So if you go back to 2013 and you care about social justice, you should be saying, yay, America. Whatever we've been doing, let's keep doing it. Let's do exactly what we've been doing. Let's not make a change because this is unbelievable, the progress we're making. Well, that's not what happened. So that's the first story, and we're going to try to figure out why did it stop? Why didn't it continue? Second story is very brief because it's such a prototypical, almost boring story. My story is the totally prototypical Jewish American Ashkenazi story. All 4 grandparents born in Russia, Poland, and Belarus. They all came here as teenagers, had super heavy accents. They all worked in the garment district. They all had kids who worked their way up in the world. My mother told me, I'll never forget, my mother telling me that, I forget, the setting, I just very vividly remember her telling me that, Jews think that Israel is the promised land, but it's not, John, she said. It's America. America is the promised land for the Jews, she said. And as I've traveled the world, and as I've seen various systems, and as I've talked to Jews in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, say, oh, how do you, I thought Jews were mostly in America and Canada. How'd your family end up in Buenos Aires? Because my grandfather didn't get off the boat at the right time. And I've really come to appreciate the beauty, the excellence of British institutions. You go around the world, places settled by Britain. Now, obviously, colonialism, lots of horrible stories, but the places settled by British institutions are doing pretty well. And the places settled by Spanish or French or Portuguese institutions, not so good. So if you want to construct a promised land for the Jews, I think a rich, fertile continent with 2 giant oceans on either side and British institutions, I'm there for that. So that's my story. My wife's story is much more interesting. My wife, Jane, in the back, is Korean American. Her father was born in 1928 in Seoul, Korea, under Japanese occupation. Both of his parents had died by the time he was 6. He was raised by his older siblings. He was a scrappy little kid. He was little because he was malnourished. They didn't have much food back then. He tells stories of his siblings splitting a hard-boiled egg, and it was just amazing because it was protein. And he was so scrappy that he taught himself English. He bought a couple of dictionaries, and he would catch English wherever he could, and he talked with the American soldiers who were there by then. That's when he was in his teens and early 20s. And he made himself useful to the American Army. And a sergeant or lieutenant thought he was really impressive and brought him in to help translate. He would write letters. He created his own translation shop. He'd help American servicemen write letters to their Korean sweethearts that they just met. And he impressed some people who found him sponsorship at a Christian university in rural Virginia. And so he gets on a cargo ship, a 20-day journey to San Francisco, has almost nothing in his pockets, makes it to Bridgewater College in Virginia, gets a second bachelor degree, and then goes on for a PhD in economics, becomes a tenured professor at Penn State, has a long and distinguished career. And he is incredibly patriotic. I asked him a couple of years ago, we were talking, my wife was helping him to write an autobiography. He's now 93 years old. And I said, Aboji, which is Korean for elder, or father or elder, what was it like in Virginia in the 50s? I mean, wasn't there a lot of racism? And he said, well, I never really had any problem. That's amazing. He said, people, they wanted to touch my hair. The girls wanted to touch my hair. They said it's like a hairbrush. They said it's like boar bristles. They'd never seen an Asian person. They'd never seen an East Asian, and the hair was different. Now, of course, he could have taken that as a horrible microaggression, or he could have interpreted it as they're curious. They're curious about it, and that's the way he interpreted it. So, two very different family trajectories. Of course, there are many Korean Americans now, but he was relatively early, 1954, before the main wave of migration. He was a real pioneer, but he is fiercely patriotic. Now, of course, the Black story is much more complicated and is not quite so sunny and straight up. But of course, in this 50-year sprint from 1963 to 2013, the Black story is the central drama, and while it's much more complicated, it is still a story of extraordinary progress. Much more to go, but still extraordinary progress. So what is it that made America able to do this? What is it that made America so great? And I don't mean perfect, no country is perfect, and certainly not America, but a great country is one that can improve. A great country is one that, when forced to confront its flaws, actually is able to make change. And I would argue that a big part of the answer is liberalism. That's not going to come as a surprise to you, but let me unpack that a little bit. So liberalism, as the word I assume is used in this room and it's used on the JALB website, we're talking about not the left, we're talking about sort of classical ideas of liberalism that are the heart of Enlightenment thinking. And so Adam Smith, who talked about, in terms of economic freedom, he talked about allowing every man to pursue his own interest in his own way upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. So there's always been this notion of individual rights, and we want a society that makes room for people to live the way they want, to construct lives of meaning for them. We don't want to tell people what to do. Here's the noted sociologist Robert Nisbet. The hallmark of liberalism is devotion to the individual, especially to his political, civil, and then increasingly his social rights. What tradition is to the conservative and use of power is to the radical, we'll come back to that, individual autonomy is to the liberal. So it's fundamentally about autonomy, granting people autonomy. We want to create a world in which people have autonomy. Francis Fukuyama, one of the greatest writers on liberalism today, has a fabulous book. I haven't read it, but I've heard enough podcasts that I can say it's a fabulous book. And if you've read anything by him, he's amazing. And yet another, American success story. Parents interned as Japanese, but again, fiercely patriotic. And Fukuyama said on the podcast with Yasha Monk, he says, here's 3 reasons why liberalism is the best political system. Now here I'm doing this from memory, so I might have gotten this exact wording wrong, but here's 3 reasons why liberalism is so great. First, it's the best way ever discovered to handle diversity. It's really the only way that has a track record of success. It grew out of the wars, the century of wars between Catholics and Protestants. And finally, they just said, you know what? We can't take this anymore. Let's agree to not agree on the highest things, but let's agree on the need for peace and coexistence. And that's the origin of liberalism. And it's been handling diversity better than any other system ever since. Second reason is a moral reason, which is that autonomy is a basic human good, and liberalism does better than any other system to allow human flourishing. And the third reason is an interesting one that I hadn't thought of. He said, liberalism is by far the best system for economic growth. There is no other way to get wealthy other than having a huge amount of oil. If you put that aside, if you don't have just a huge amount of oil underground, the only way to get really wealthy is a liberal society with free market capitalism. So liberal societies have been the richest in history, and of course prosperity helps everyone flourish. Prosperity helps people live longer, happier, healthier lives, even if it's not distributed equally, and it never is, and that's an ongoing moral issue. But he just made the basic point that a liberal society, by creating so much prosperity, opens up possibilities for flourishing that no other system can provide. So now that we have a sense of what liberalism is and why it's so important and valuable, let's look back at this amazing 50-year sprint that I told you about a moment ago. Was that due to liberalism of the sort that I described? And I think the answer is in part, but we have to give a lot of credit to progressives, because progressives at every step were pushing for change, for more rights, more justice, more equality. But they did this within a liberal framework. The late 20th century, the whole 20th century, but especially the mid to late 20th century, there was a prevailing liberal framework. Even conservatives like William Buckley, everyone was operating within a prevailing liberal framework. And when you have progressives pushing for change, marching, protesting, demanding change within a liberal framework, the results are spectacular. That's the job of liberals, of progressives, is to question why do we do things this way? Why can't we do it in a different way, in a better way? And you push for change. And then you need, so they're the gas pedal, as it were, but then you need conservatives to be the brake, because anytime the progressives get to just change everything, they go too far always. Since the French Revolution, you get a disaster. So you need progressives pushing for change. You need conservatives saying, hold on a second, read Edmund Burke, slow down, Stanford history yelling, slow down. So that's the world that many of us older people grew up in. Within a prevailing liberal framework, there was a tension between progressives and conservatives, and then also libertarians come in so there's a kind of a three-way balance, which really worked. So that's where things were going all the way up to the 2010s. Now, why did things change? Why did progressives in particular become illiberal? And that, I sense, is what you were talking about with the focus on CSJ and a lot of these ideologies that are deeply, deeply illiberal. What happened? Why didn't we stay on track? So a few thoughts about what happened in the 2010s. Of course, Greg Lukianoff and I and Pamela Kresge, our lead research assistant and writing with us, we came up with, we told it as a detective story where there were 6 threads all coming together around, actually it was 2014. I mean, there's some signs that 2012 is down the set, but 2014 is the year that all these fuses, all these threads kind of come together and boom, they begin to blow up. A whole bunch of things start happening on campus in 2014. Cancel culture emerges in 2014, and then of course the Yale Halloween thing is 2015. So just very briefly, just to list a few, we have rising political polarization for a variety of reasons. And there's research in political science. The more you hate the other side, the more the ends justify the means in defeating them. And you see this all over the world, in Hungary, Poland, everywhere. If you really hate the other side, and your guys are doing some dirty tricks, some anti-democratic subversion, that's okay, because we really hate the other side. So we had rising political polarization. We had vastly overprotected kids who became fragile, who then get on social media too early and get immersed in these ideas from social media. Something I just learned a month ago, after I had a big article in The Atlantic in April, and after I submitted it, someone sent me an article saying, actually, Tumblr is the petri dish in which most of these bad ideas we're talking about was nurtured. Sort of like, it was like a lab leak from Tumblr into the broader society. But all these ideas about trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggressions, it's all nurtured in Tumblr in particular, around 2012 plus or minus. So for a variety of reasons, a lot of stuff is happening to formulate this new ideology, which is really, really illiberal. And this is when we can start speaking about the far left being illiberal. Now, of course, the far right is also illiberal, and shockingly, the far right has lost all touch with conservatism. There is no way to connect Edmund Burke with anything happening on the right nowadays. Of course, the center right is still very Burkean, and they're taking part in these sorts of discussions, generally in a sort of anti-Trumpian conservative intellectual tradition. I think is brilliant. I've learned a lot from them. So we start getting this new breed, this new ideology on the left, In the Coddling, we call it common enemy identity politics. We say there's no problem with having identity politics. In any organization, groups need to be able to advocate for their interests. But you can do it by coming together against a common enemy, which is always dark and leads to violence and is awful. Or you can do it by emphasizing common humanity, which is what, of course, all of you in this room, what Fair for All is all about. A lot of these organizations that are now working against this liberalism, we draw from this Martin Luther King tradition of a more inclusive sort of identity politics. So I just want to point out, and here's some very new stuff. I haven't put this down before, but it's been kicking around ever since this crazy stuff started, which is there are so many ways in which we're going backwards morally since 2014, 2015. I'll just list a few. After 50 years of extraordinary moral progress, here are some of the things we're losing. So moral progress is due process. That's not something that people get around the world. Due process, you don't rush to judgment, but that's being replaced by instant trial by Twitter. The accusation is the verdict, the investigation is the punishment, and you're likely to be fired within 24 hours of an accusation in many cases. So this is incredibly fast moral regression in just the space of about 7 or 8 years. Second, equality before the law. How long did we struggle for that? And certainly we didn't have it before 1965. We still don't have it perfectly, but we're making progress. We've been making progress on that until very recently. I'm sure many of you can quote by memory some of the lines from Ibram Kendi, things like the only cure for past discrimination is present discrimination. Like, that kind of like sounds like a logical thing, but if you think about that for a moment, that's absurd. That doesn't make any sense. It certainly isn't the only cure, and it certainly is advocating for inequality before the law. A third area that we're losing, intent matters. The long tradition of English and back to Roman law, intent matters. If someone does something totally by accident, it might still be punishable, but it's not nearly as bad as it was done on purpose. I mean, that's really basic stuff, but we're losing that. It's not intent that matters, it's impact that matters. Now, oh, by the way, the impact is not objective. The impact is as much as someone can get angry at you. A fourth way that we're losing moral progress is the idea of treating people as individuals with rights. That's about as basic to liberalism as it comes, but we're losing that to be replaced by seeing people as members of groups to be praised, damned, or fired or fined as members of that group. And finally, it's taken thousands of years to overcome ancient purity laws and witch hunts. The idea of guilt by association is very deep in the human mind, and it's hard to get it out, but we've made a lot of progress, and now we're going backwards. If you simply like something on Twitter, there's only been a couple of really critical reviews of the Coddling American Mind. The first one was a big one in the Atlantic by Moira Weigel. She had 9 different ways of saying that we're bad people. She never said whether we were wrong, but one of her ways was, and they opened the book with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Do you know who else quotes Solzhenitsyn? Jordan Peterson. Boom, she got us. Okay, but that's an argument from a person with a PhD? So that's guilt by association. And it's also like, I'm pretty happy to be associated with both of those men. Anyway, so that's what we've lost. So I'm giving you 3 problems with this new illiberalism. One, it's morally regressive. Here's the second problem with the new illiberalism. It's structurally stupid. In my Atlantic article, I made the point that Americans are not getting stupider, but if you put us in a group where we challenge each other and learn from each other, if you imagine a jury, if you imagine the Defense Intelligence Agency, if you imagine a university seminar class, we push ideas off each other, we challenge each other. You're never allowed to say, if you say that, I'm going to punch you in the face. That's just a totally illegal move. So if you have that give and take, you have all the John Stuart Mill processes, that's how the group gets smarter. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. So here I'm channeling Jonathan Rauch as well as John Stuart Mill. That's what makes us smart, is coming together in ways with viewpoint diversity, but the new illiberalism never makes arguments. They never say why I'm wrong. They never say why the coddling is wrong. They only say why you're bad, and they try to get you punished. And they can win Pyrrhic victory after Pyrrhic victory. It can get policies put through in the San Francisco School Board. They can get schools renamed, but they do it by intimidation, not by persuasion. So what happens? There's one day a year when the majority vote counts, and that's election day. And so this is a huge problem for the left. If you try to win by intimidation rather than persuasion, you can do that in a dictatorship. You can't do that in a democracy. And finally, the third reason why this new illiberalism is so bad is that it's depressogenic. It literally makes its adherents depressed. We originally wanted to call the coddling disempowered. That was Greg's idea. That's exactly what this is about, is that these ideas disempower young people. Now, that's not a very catchy title. I'm really glad that our editor overruled us. But there's now a lot more evidence that it is depressogenic, and especially from members of marginalized communities, members of identity groups that embrace it are harmed by it very directly. Here's a little anecdote where I first really encountered it. Soon after all this craziness began, I was invited to do a panel at the NYU Law School. And it was me and Anthony Appia and what's her name from Harvard Law School, Chinese-American law professor. What? No, not Amy Cho.
Jeannie Gerson.
Gerson, yes, that's right.
Jeannie
Stu Gerson, right. So it's us, and then there was one philosopher from New Zealand. Oh, and then there was a law student who was a progressive activist. So we're all there on the panel, and she's talking about the incredible levels of violence that NYU students were subjected to. I said, violence? Like, really? And she was, well, like, emotional violence, like verbal violence. And in the conversation, it came out as she was trying to justify this stance about why she and her friends feel so marginalized at NYU, which is just about the most gay-friendly, inclusive university you can possibly imagine. Why does she feel so marginalized? And she said, well, I mean, you have to admit, this university was not built for people like me. Now, she was Latino. I don't know. I think she might have been LGBT. I don't know. But she identified as non-white. And so she said, you must admit, this university was not built for people like me. And I said, yes, I must admit that. And it wasn't built for people like me. I'm Jewish, and Anthony Appia is gay and black, and Jeannie Sue Gerson is Chinese American, and it wasn't built for any of us. So what? So what? The fact that we've made enormous progress is a reason why you're going to sit in a corner and say, well, it wasn't always perfect. So this was my first exposure to what I now call self-marginalization. There are a lot of marginalized peoples in our universities. Most of them, I believe, are self-marginalized. At least those that think like her. I don't want to judge everyone, but those that embrace this way of thinking are harming themselves, and now we have the data to prove it. There have now been a couple of studies that I have them listed on some websites. There are a couple of studies now showing that the first people to get depressed in the teen mental health crisis, it's young women on the left. This is research by Zach Goldberg analyzing data from a Pew survey and then another survey. There's two data sets now that show that it's especially young women on the left who get more depressed first and are by far the most depressed. And then there's that new study out, many of you have seen, from the Center for the Study of Political Issues, the one on LGBTQ identity, and how rapidly the rate of self-identification as LGBTQ took off after 2017, especially throughout the 2010s, but it really goes way up in 2017, and how it appears to be in part a political identity, because it's a very large group. The largest group, I think, is young women who say they're bisexual but have only had male partners. So it's an identity that they're asserting. Now that's fine if they want to assert an identity, but they also are the group that is by far the most depressed. I can't prove causality here, but this fits with everything. If you embrace this idea that everyone's against me, the world is terrible, everyone hates me, no matter what I do, I'll be treated unfairly, and you do this after this 50-year sprint of extraordinary progress, yeah, you're going to end up pretty depressed, demoralized, and disempowered. So, so that's why I think it's urgent that we fight back against this, that this new ideology is doing a lot of damage to our country, to our young people, to our politics. So what do we do? The final section of my talk. Our minds evolve to think in certain ways easily. one thing we do really easily is us versus them. That was great on truth number 3 of the Coddling. The world is divided into good people and evil people. And I hear this a lot. If those people, those woke people are doing these bad things, then we have to fight back and fight fire with fire. And maybe there are times that you have to do that. But a culture war is very different from any other kind of war. In a real war, you can literally kill your opponents and then they're dead. Okay? You can literally win by overpowering them. In fact, that's generally the way you win a war. A culture war is very different. The harder you hit them, the stronger they get. Because it's all about just perceptions and anger. And the more you can pull dirty tricks on them, or the more your people say extreme things, the more video clips they have to share outrage about how crazy your side is. So we're deep in a polarization spiral. We had a chapter on this in the Coddling. Things are going crazy. We are in big trouble as a country because left and right, the far left and far in particular, are spinning out of orbit into their separate epistemic worlds that are armed for bear. Is that the expression? Like with heavy weapons. So we're in big trouble. And so there is sometimes a value to fighting back. I co-founded Heterodox Academy, and even though more of our members are on the left, and especially libertarian and centrist, there's often pressure to be pulled to the right, and many people want us to ally with the right and fight, and push back. And I've always resisted that, in part because I think the way you're not going to change universities by attacking them from the outside. We're trying to work from the inside. We have a fabulous new president, John Tomasi, whose motto is let's build good things. Let's build good things and people will come. People are tired, they're exhausted. They want to be in a place like this where they can talk with people and share ideas and debate and dispute. And so motivated by this idea of it, in a culture war, you don't win it by overpowering the other side. In fact, I like to think a lot about complex dynamical systems. It's a very abstract concept, I'm not going to try to explain it, but a complex dynamical system is something more like the weather or the economy. It's not like a clock or a car. We say, oh, it's broken here, and if I fix the carburetor, it'll work. Complex social systems are not like that. You don't fix them and they're done. They're systems that are constantly in motion, influenced by a variety of parameters. And the way you change it is not by attacking it, not by overpowering it, not by pushing it. It's by changing parameters. And that's what we're trying to do at Heterodox Academy. That's what I urge you all to think about. How do you change parameters? So things like more hostility or less, that's a parameter change. Things like more people of color advocating on this side versus less, that's a parameter change. So there are all kinds of ways to change systems where over time, the balance will change. And so I just want to end with 2 quotations that I think illustrate the kind of liberalism that we're all talking about here, the kind of positive, loving, open liberalism. So the first is a quote from Pauli Murray that we have in the Coddling. And this is a woman writing in the 1940s, before Martin Luther King was really on the scene. She's what we now call either gay or trans, black, became ordained as a minister. There's now a Yale College named after her. And she says, I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. This is the way that works. This is the way that has a long proven track record, not just in the United States, but in South Africa as well. So I'll close with a quotation from Nelson Mandela. People respond in accordance to how you relate to them. If you approach them on the basis of violence, that's how they'll react. But if you say, we want peace, we want stability, we can then do a lot of things that will contribute toward the progress of our society. And that, my friends, is the liberal attitude that we're here to celebrate. Thank you.
All right, we have questions. Is this working? No, does this one work? There we go. Okay, Mars.
Dr. Haidt, thank you for coming here. You have an,
You're going to have to speak up anyway. It doesn't seem to be working.
Face that way and say it loud. I'll hear you.
Dr. Haidt, thank you for coming to this event. I have a question for you regarding an analogy you had in the Coddling film, and one of the other books regarding morality. the name escapes me.
The Righteous Mind.
The Righteous Mind. Thank you. You have the analogy of the elephant and the rider being the logic part of our brains, the elephant being the emotional aspects. The way I see it as of this moment, we're not just torn about by one, but by two conflicting narratives that appeal to the emotional aspects of both the left and the right. We're being dragged apart by that. The two elephants are pulling us apart. I don't see how the introduction of logic or reason without a third elephant coming into the room is at all possible. But at the rate of which we're flying apart in terms of a unified society, I don't see how it's possible to resolve any issue without introducing a third elephant in the room.
What's the third elephant in the room? That's a pretty crowded room here.
The third elephant being nuance and reason, that acknowledgement of the valid points that both left and right have to offer. And liberalism relies on reason, it relies on dialogue. And without that, we don't have a liberal democracy. So how do we reintroduce that third element?
Wow, that is a really good question, because liberalism does tend to appeal to very cerebral people. It doesn't do that well electorally because it doesn't go for the heart, it doesn't go for the gut, it goes for the head. So you're right, that is a real problem. We can make all the arguments we want, and so much of my early research is on how, if I'm inclined to agree with you, if my elephant is leaning towards you, and you make an argument, I'm going to ask myself, can I believe it? Yeah, I can believe that, and I'll believe it. But if I'm leaning away from you, I'm asking myself, must I believe it? Am I forced to believe it? And the answer is always no. I'm always smart enough to find out why I don't have to believe you. And so the lesson that I try to give in The Righteous Mind, and when I talk to anybody in the persuasion business, is talk to the elephant first. There is no point in giving data and logic to a person who is emotionally disposed against you. And if you think about how often you've won an argument with your spouse or your child or anybody else who is angry at you, probably 0 times. It's just not a good strategy. Now, of course, I don't always take my advice. I'm very good at giving advice. But for what we're doing here, the advice is, don't just go trying to make arguments and expecting people to follow. Now, if you don't make logical or reasoned arguments, you just talk to the heart, then you're a demagogue. So a true leader, and here we can point to Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, the 3 presidents we've had in my lifetime, that were really good with words. They could really make your heart soar, depending on which party you were in. But they also were really smart, and they also, especially Clinton and Obama, I don't want to make judgments, but they also had a real head for policy. So that would be my advice here, is whenever you're talking with someone, you can think they're as illogical as, they're completely illogical and crazy, but there's no point in saying that. Also read Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Start by acknowledging what they're right about. Do something to show that you're not engaging in just a normal battle. So I guess what I'm arguing is you should all read The Righteous Mind and Dale Carnegie, and then you too can become persuasion experts. You can first go for the heart and then go for the head. But that's an answer to your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Pamela, who's calling?
Okay. You talked a little bit about the sort of spiral that's induced by culture war, excesses. And one aspect of that that's very apparent to me is the capacity for threat inflation.
For threat inflation?
Threat inflation. And the sense in which there's a belief in the battle absolutely necessary. The liberal,
that's right,
that in general, we'll take the most egregious examples of kind of illiberal arguments on the left. Imagine that this is a thing that exists in virtually every school, everywhere in America. And there's even here, I think today, here are sort of 2 things being said and both getting vigorous. One, that Americans in general don't subscribe to these most extreme beliefs and are probably more in line with the beliefs that are expressed here, if we vigorous not at the same time, I believe that we're facing kind of an existential threat, that the appropriate analogy might be, say, the Soviet Union or some other very extreme and ideological conflict. And for me, I think it's definitely the case that there's sort of a fundamentalist aspect the conflict that's taking place right now, intellectually, philosophically, but I'm very worried about the threat inflation, psyching ourselves out and never getting around to talking about exactly what those liberal values. I think it's a sufficiently amorphous term that we can say that without ever getting around to defining what it is in a way that's actually compelling to anyone who might be there.
Thank you, Camille. You're absolutely right about that. Throughout my career in psychology, the great example of messaging, the great example of a metaphor that worked was the death tax. If you frame inheritance tax, death tax, like, wow, we don't have death. But a better one, a more powerful one, would be perhaps the most powerful political metaphor of our lifetime, which changed history, is the Flight 93 election. I think that was Michael Anton who coined it, I can't remember. But once you got a bunch of Republicans who see the 2016 election not as a battle between these two candidates that they felt negative about both of them, but as this is Flight 93, we're going to be crashing to the Pentagon. We have to rush the cockpit. If Hillary's elected, she's going to point out, they're going to take over the government, they're going to flood the country with immigrants, it'll be Democratic majority forever and ever. We got to do something, whatever it is. And so, so a lot of people voted for that reason, and they looked the other way when Trump did some really awful things. So, yes, metaphors are powerful, and as you say, threat metaphors, imminent death, danger, disaster, not just for me, for our group. That's what really motivates. Politics is not so much about threats to me, it's actually more about threats to our group that really motivates people. And the situation is far more dire than that because social media now keeps us immersed. If you're at all partisan, you are immersed in unbelievably powerful evidence that the other side has all these terrible plans. And half of what you see is based on truth. Like it's not all made up. Some of it is based on truth and exaggerated. Some of it's entirely true. So social media keeps our threat receptors flooded. There's no room to think. And so this is why I'm so focused on structural reforms. Right now, with social media the way it is, I don't know that we can really restore sanity to almost anything. I shouldn't say that. We can work within groups and institutions we can, but as a country, we're going to keep going to crazy land as long as social media is the way it is. So we've got to have a variety of reforms to tone that down. Identity authentication, changes to the virality architecture. There are things we can do so that it wouldn't be so much threat in our faces all the time. But I guess, again, I haven't heard the dialogue other than the last 20 minutes before I got here. I guess I would just ask the degree to which you might be subject to that too. That our community that is concerned about a set of threats, we can be pretty apocalyptic about it too, and might that cloud our thinking so that we see our opponents as less than human, and we don't see some avenues for success. I just want to raise that. Thank you.
Way up. For me, it seems that in terms of moral frameworks, communities can pick a moral framework that's really high bar for community members, things that are actually going to be difficult for them to achieve.
Wait, can you just put the mic down? And it's the hardest of all is when I hear half of the syllables.
I'm trying to do this on live.
But they can't hear it with the microphone either.
All right. So communities have a choice seemingly in terms of moral frameworks of picking a set of morals that are a high bar, that are difficult for the community members themselves to achieve, something to aspire to. Or they can pick something of a low bar. When I hear of this reference, and when I look at his particular version of anti-racism as a moral framework, it strikes me as a low bar. For example, being black, it doesn't really give me any definition of what a good black person is. It's too influenced I myself describe to. I've already made it. And it puts me in a good camp just for being black. That's very powerful. There's a lot of other communities that sort of form their morals that way, where it's like all you have to do is not be that thing. Yeah. And I'm wondering, and also thinking about Martin Luther King, especially if anyone's read The Wrath of King, he has a lot of moments where he calls out how much he loves Mahatma Gandhi, really policing his own community and saying that you have to achieve that, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, I think part of his award is that he gave a large group of people a set of things where your life would be morally meaningful if you hit these points, and a lot of them are white folks previously, that the only thing you need to do to have a successfully moral life is listen to black people. That's kind of the end.
Okay, wow. This is, okay, so I think what you're hitting on is something really profound that it's very hard for you to express with the impoverished moral language that we have today. So let me see if I can reframe it for you. The normal human way of thinking about all of this is virtues, not values, virtues. Every society is a virtue ethics society except for ours. We switched, and this here I get from reading conservative writings like James Hunter. We switched, and he blames psychologists for this in part. In the 20th century, we dropped the language of virtues, which is so rich in Victorian times and the early 20th century. We dropped that all, and it's values. I have values, you have values, who's to say? Values are thin, values are not inspiring. Values are like clothing that you can put on or take off. Virtues are excellences of character validated by the community that makes you more fit as a member of the community. This is normal human child rearing and moral education's virtues. And I think what you put your finger on is that what King was doing and what the early civil rights leaders were doing was they were training their people in an extraordinary set of virtues. They were Christian virtues, they were American virtues, they were African American virtues. There was a set of virtues that were hard to achieve and that were inspired. I'm getting chills just talking about this. Thinking, I mean, the videos you see of the young people, black and white, being trained to go into those terrible situations, and they would train them by having to withstand racial slurs and being spit on. And they were toughening them. That was hard, and that was inspiring, and that won. That inspired others. Values talk is empty, and what you're saying is Kennedy doesn't even have values talk. It's all just structural, and everything is bad until everything is equal, in a bean counting way, and you don't have to. There are no virtues to aspire to. It's a morally and emotionally empty kind of worldview. Thank you for that. I hope, did I get that right? Is that what you're after?
That's great, Frank. I didn't know if I could lost out for a minute.
Yes, you've been speaking prose your whole life.
Right, so how much time do we have?
We are supposed to be at dinner around 6, so we can go a little longer as long as people don't mind not having a break.
Okay, Charles.
Really quickly, I want to piggyback on what Camille said, because he made a point that many in the room would nod their heads about the average person doesn't agree with the illiberal stuff, but then also talk about the existential threat. So one of the things I try to point out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we do that, is there's a vast majority of people, right? Majority of the country, as many in the room would say, don't agree with that, but we tend not to be able to or not focused on speaking to them, right? We get a room of people who agree on the one, or we get a room of people saying Kennedy's wrong about X, but no one's ever communicating with those people, and they get to vote, they have a voice, but they don't hear any of that. So do you think that's a problem, and how do we get that message to regular people?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think if this was 6 to 9 months ago, I would have just fully embraced what you said and your framing of how you think things are. Because when 2014 stuff begins to happen, Greg and I write the Coddling, then things blow up in 2015, but it's just on campus mostly. Then it spreads everywhere else. Then it gets more intense, and then Trump is elected, and COVID hits, and George Floyd is killed. And that period, especially from 2020 until about 6 to 9 months ago, it was just going further and further to crazy town. And it really was the case that in many situations, if you so much as breathe the word of dissent to Kennedy, you're putting not just your life in jeopardy, but your kids could be kicked out of the school that So, I mean, it was getting completely insane. But a funny thing happened as it got more and more insane, because almost everybody is sane, almost everybody is reasonable. The middle 80% of the country, let's say, which kept its head down and was intimidated, and all they could do is vote to kick out San Francisco school board people. You can vote, in privacy of the voting booth, you can express yourself, but you don't want to express yourself in public. I feel like that fear is lifting. I feel like there's now been enough movement the other way, enough people are beginning to poke their heads up, and people on the left and Democratic strategists are saying, this is incredibly self-destructive. So I think that things are turning now. There are some things in our country that are not like pendulums. They're actually positive feedback loops, like a tower. So the further over it goes, the harder it's going to be to get it right. But public opinion is like a pendulum, where the further permissible consensus moves from what we believe, the easier, the more the force to bring it back. So I think if you can do it in a way that doesn't sound like you're just, angry right-winger using the right-wing's tropes, but actually you're a caring, thoughtful person who acknowledges, et cetera, et cetera. So I think now is the time for people to stand up and in a polite, reasoned, principled way, say what you're thinking.
Can I just, as a moderator, ask, what do you think the tipping point was?
Well, so I think, so there's, I think at least looking at it from the left's point of view, at least, there was a lot of hope that things would go back to normal once Trump was out. There was a lot of hope that Biden's presidency would change things and that the January 6th insurrection would completely discredit the Republicans. And I think it was the summer of last year, summer 2021, the Afghanistan plot was such a disaster. And the fact that the Republicans came surging back to the point where, who thought that the Republicans, the fact that what the Democrats were doing is so clearly not working, and the Virginia election, I think that might have been the turning point. Then the Virginia election, where it was clear, now the right has a roadmap. Just nominate someone who's not crazy, and people will vote for him. And I think that scared the hell out of a lot of Democrats, like, oh, maybe we can't just keep doing what we're doing.
Hi, John.
Speak up really loud.
Okay, all right. This volume good?
Yep, I hear you.
All right, perfect. So my name is Hannah, and I actually hosted an event that I was inspired to because of the Coddling. So I hosted a event with Ion Ali on free speech on college campuses. And when I was promoting this event on my college campus, going around putting up flyers,
You got torn down.
Yeah, definitely got turned down, but it was a situation that just had me starstruck. And for context, I just graduated from the University of Central Florida. While asking for permission to put up the poster about free speech, I was told that I wasn't allowed to put anything that would offend anyone. And the guy who used this analogy said, for instance, if you put up something about Biden, that's not allowed because then maybe that would offend someone. And I, at this point, I was starstruck. And this is supposed to be a university. This is supposed to be a place for open-minded inquiry. And as a college student, I didn't feel like I had that. And I guess my question for you is, when it comes to structural change, what can we do as students from within?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So what you see there is the direct conflict of people with a different sense of the telos of the university. So university is organized around the pursuit of truth and inquiry. Where it's called the academy because we're modeled after Plato's academy, and our ideal is a group of people sitting around talking about ideas and disputing with each other. So that's one worldview. Then there's a bureaucratic worldview, which is cover your ass, avoid controversy. The most important thing is not truth, it's not ending up in the newspaper. That's all that matters. And so why would we let someone put up a Biden poster if you don't, like, what could we know? So that's the bureaucratic mindset. They're completely incompatible. This is why we had a whole chapter on bureaucracy, the growth of bureaucracy, the huge growth of bureaucracy since the 60s and 70s in universities. And so what can you do as a student? Well, two things. The first is every organization that is going to be devoted to the pursuit of truth or almost any other purpose has to get free from the DEI bureaucracy. The DEI bureaucracy isn't just a bureaucracy, it's an ideological bureaucracy that's very much shaped by American education schools. So that bureaucracy is able to put things on that are completely incompatible with the normal functions of a university. So I don't know how you step that back, although here's an idea. Here's actually one encouraging thing. I gave a talk at St. Mary's University in Minneapolis, a Catholic university. They have moral resources, they have virtues, and they don't have a DEI department. They have a department or a head of dignity and inclusion. Dignity and inclusion, and that encompasses everything. That's the Pauli Murray thing right there. So there are things that now you can advocate for that as a student, but that's sort of what's necessary to get get it back. Here's what you can do as a student. Almost every, look, the subtitle of our book was How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. To the extent that a lot of the restrictions are done for your benefit, or at least justified for your benefit. What I'm hoping to see, whenever I speak to undergraduates, I always say, one of the best things you can do is tell the adults to back off. Say, you know what, we don't want this protection. This is preventing us from learning and growing. Thank you very much, but please back off. And Gen Z generally doesn't say that. Gen Z is protesting certain things, but they don't tend to protest these things that are affecting the whole generation. So that's what I would urge you to do. A lot of, like the trigger warning idea, just so much of it is done because adults think that your generation is so fragile. And there's some truth to it, but the way you get unfragile is by being exposed to things. So that's what I would say. The first chapter of the Coddling is the one on anti-fragility. We put it up online for free, so you can just go to thecoddling.com. Right there on the homepage, there's a link. Send it to your friends, send it to your teachers, send it to your professors, send it to the dean of the dean of students, whatever it is.
I actually want to mention something. I'm attending medical school in the fall. But while applying for medical school, one of the application essays mentioned coddling and asked us to write an essay or a short essay comparing it with also Angela Dunkworth's Grit.
Great. Okay.
So I really love that they also gave that perspective.
Okay, that's encouraging because wokeness is coming into medical schools in a big way, and not just medical schools. We all know this. We've all read Mary Weiss, and she's done such great coverage of all the professions. But that's encouraging. But yeah, and I think in medicine you'll find a more receptive audience. Although I have to say, I know somebody in the medical community at NYU who said that she got in trouble for mentioning BMI. She's not allowed to talk about body mass index anymore because that's fat shaming.
Okay, I was like, well, BMI, it's not the best way. But I'm a little nervous right now. Oh. I just recently got your book, The Righteous Mind, so I'm like, it's like a week and all. That's all right. Anyway.
I exist.
You're a human person! But I wanted to kind of like offer and ask, I guess, because the part that I was found intriguing was when you were talking about how you said young girls that identify as leftist or the depression, and you said it's not causation, there's a correlation maybe. Because I'm thinking, there's a lot of things to be depressed about. Literally anything a teenage girl likes, people hate. I just think of Twilight as an example. Nobody had a reason, yeah, they were horrible movies. They're bad books. But nobody had a reason to hate the girls liking Edward and whatever. But people took every opportunity they could to shit on young teenage girls just enjoying things. And I was one of those teenage girls. So I think there's a lot more that we have to think about why that's happening. And I know that you said correlation, so I'm not saying that you like, but I also then thought about Tumblr, because you mentioned that it's kind of like a petri dish, and I was on Tumblr in 2014. I was there with the girls having a blast. And for me, the reason that I went there was because it felt like a place where I could find other people. Like, I lived in Calgary at the time. There were no racialized Black folks, and at the time I just wanted to be around different types of people, and Tumblr was that place for it. And so I understand that like online spaces can be horrible, literally terrible, but I also think about the fact that why are so many young people drawn to it? Why are so many of us like, fuck institutions, we don't care, sorry, my language, sorry, we don't care about any of this stuff, we just want to go online and find our space there. And the thing that kind of made me realize why was the response in the room when you said it. People started laughing about something, and I was just like, we're here talking about compassion, yet we're laughing about teenage girls or teenage people being sensitive. We're laughing about people being sensitive. And I know that we've talked about, meeting people in good faith, assuming ignorance first, but I also would add, or hopefully offer, to assume all the people that we're talking about, compassion more than anything. And that is also in relation to thinking that someone is too sensitive. Does that make sense? I hope that's making sense. I just think we do too much in immediately saying, okay, well, the rest of the world has problems, so get over it. And it's like we haven't set young people up enough to even hear that argument first. Like, I'm not a middle class person, so I have a grid. Whenever people talk about snowflakes, I'm like, you're talking about middle class white people, to be honest. But do you know what I mean? Sorry, I don't know if this is.
I think I do. In fact, I have a little thing like in my notes before I do interviews. I have a little thing, just SAN. It stands for smile, acknowledge, and nuance. So my wife always tells me, even if I'm on the radio, John, just smile more, otherwise you get too serious. So smile, be positive, and then acknowledge, especially if you're going to criticize, acknowledge what they're right about. And then nuance, there's always nuance. And so I was making a brief argument that Tumblr had this particularly pernicious effect, but I should acknowledge Tumblr, like all these platforms, exist because there is a need for it. And the unique thing about Tumblr that I've never been on it, but just reading about it, most social media communities are done by creating networks of people. And so you meet people through people. Tumblr was unique in that it had nothing to do with social networks. It was all specific interest. You would only meet people who were interested in, a certain kind of social justice, or actually a lot of it was fan stuff. It was actually was about TV shows and movies and things. That was actually the core of it. And then there was only parts of it that got much more political. So I should acknowledge that these platforms, and Tumblr in particular, was, and especially for people who are isolated, especially for people who don't have people in their town that they can really connect to, it was a godsend. So I should acknowledge that and bring in all that nuance. And I can't really do a lot because I don't know a lot about Tumblr, and I need to learn more about it. Are you still on it?
You don't.
No.
I think I just more so, sorry, I'm so long-winded, but I think I just more so was thinking about, I appreciate your viewpoint because I think it is necessary. Like, people are a little too sensitive and can't just hear stuff. I make videos and people are like, you should have put a trigger warning, and I'm like, get over it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just like, get over it. And I'm like 30 and people think I'm way too old. Like, that's the online space. The minute you hit 25, you're old. But I think I'm trying to find the nuance, I guess, and looking to you for that in how do we meet people where they're at in that very sensitive place and acknowledge and have compassion for that, because that sensitivity grew from somewhere. Like, if you're constantly used to people saying shit to you, you're always defensive, so I'm just.
That's right. And that's why I think we have to start so much earlier. And that's why I'm a big fan of Lenore Skenazy, who are Free Range Kids, and she and I co-founded an organization called Let Grow, because if kids have a lot of time out together in groups, they tease each other, they toughen up, but they also learn compassion, they learn to regulate the aggression. And so those are the skills that Gen Z, you're a millennial, but the people behind you, those are the skills that they were deprived of. And then they go on social media, they go on Tumblr, and they don't have the social skills to not be hurt by lots of things. So thank you for that.
Wow. Okay. Let's do. Can we do a lightning round?
Okay, I'll be much briefer in my answer. Sorry about that.
One sentence. I just want to be clear, and everyone should know this. There's no racial categorization for snowflakes. Snowflakes can be in all shapes and sizes. I know quite a few black young ladies who they fall to that category. Just want to make
I'll just briefly add to that research by Annette Leroux and Robert Putnam on child rape strategies shows that you're right. It's class, not race. That middle class, upper middle class black people are doing the same stupid stuff as middle class white people.
So the kids who are going to boarding school, kids who are going to Martha's Vineyard for the summer, kids are going to Sag Harbor, the kids in Jack and Jill. Yeah, I know a few blacks.
Yes, class first.
We're gonna just go this way.
Are you familiar with Upton Chessel and Horseman pedagogy?
No.
Basically, when I was a kid in the 60s, you used to get grades on virtues. And my kids fortunately went through social emotional learning under character counts before it became transformative CRT kind of stuff. So I'm wondering, what are the prospects? I mean, we talk about grades a lot, but what are the prospects for the pendulum swinging back to talk about virtues?
Yes. So I am hoping that, the mental health crisis is so astonishingly gigantic that I am hoping this is the one thing that I think might be able to push us in our, especially elementary school practices. There's no evidence that homework does any good in elementary school, certainly not in grade first, second, and third grade. Kids need a lot more play. Now I hear, I don't know enough about SEL to critique it yet. I hear sometimes that it's gone into woke stuff. A lot of the psychological ideas make sense, but it seems like a vehicle for a lot of ideology as well. But the best SEL is group play, unsupervised group play. That's what the kids really need. So it's sort of like, hey, how about we deprive them of what they really need so that they develop, like let's deprive them of vitamin C so they all develop scurvy, but then we'll give them scurvy learning courses to cope with scurvy. Yeah, not a good idea.
Great talk, by the way. What would you say to those who say you win cultural battles, cultural wars, the old-fashioned way? Is core political victories and implement the policy you want?
So okay, that means you don't fight the culture war. You do old-fashioned politics and you win elections. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you can change the culture that way.
So there's what's often said. What is it?
Politics is downstream of culture.
Yes, thank you. So right, politics. Yes, politics is downstream from culture, and I would say culture is downstream from technology these days. So technology is messing everybody up in culture. But I think that there are. Oh, I love what's his name? Roy Teixeira, Teixeira, is brilliant. He has a Substack for Liberal Patriot, and he's always saying things like this: the Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot over and over again by doing stupid culture stuff. They should focus on winning elections.
You mentioned a few social programs in the last 5 decades, but one who really stepped backward is really marginalized family and individual. Right now, the liberals, the radical left, push everything into government responsibility, and also really downgrade the role of family individuals. How do you comment on this?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble
Focus
here.
on families and individuals instead of
I'm
government.
trying to repeat. You mentioned a few social programs in the last 5 decades.
But there's a lot of social progress in the last social.
But one huge backward was marginalized family.
Oh,
right now,
yes.
the radical left shift everything back to the government, right? And the marginalized family and individual responsibility. How do you comment?
Yeah, no, that is a great point. I'm so used to talking to progressive audiences that I was basically saying, if you're a progressive, you should see that 50-year period, my first 50 years on this earth, as your greatest triumph. But conversely, other side of the coin, if you're a social conservative, you should see those 50 years as a complete disaster. And the main reason why is the loss of the family and the loss of religion and the loss of decorum and virtues and all of those things that conservatives have been saying for a long time are crucial for a good society. It's always interesting, the phrase, well, the left is on the right side of history. We're on the right side of history on this, and this. But I think there will be a few things on which it turns out that the conservatives were on the right side of history. And the importance of family stability and marriage, I think, is one of those. I think that's what you're referring to. That there are some great conservative truths. And this is what I learned by writing The Righteous Mind. I was always on the left, and it wasn't until I actually tried to read the best writings from the right and from libertarians that I actually saw, wow, there are a lot of good ideas out there. So I would recommend for anyone, the best things I read were Thomas Sowell, Conflict of Visions was absolutely incredible. And then anything by Jerry Mueller, an intellectual historian, his book called Conservatism. Those are the two works that really opened my mind. And the importance of family was one of them.
John, I've been holding on to this question the entire evening. Now that we're to the end, nearly answered it. But to what extent do we need conservatism to preserve liberalism? And I mean that particularly in the context in which, well, in the Burkean sort of conservatism's relationship to preserving institutions, building community, and on a cultural foundation of virtue, in a time in which social isolation and moral relativism has perhaps set preconditions for the liberalism we see rising on the left and the right.
Yeah, so if your question is to what extent do we need sort of social conservatism, Burkean conservatism, to have better liberalism? Is that what you're asking?
Well, essentially, yes, to make up for the things that perhaps liberalism in and of itself doesn't necessarily bring to the table an answer to some of the problems that I would argue at least are the ground from which our current tribalism is rising.
Yeah. So one way to think about it is like a single line or a dimension. Like, where do you draw the line, or how much of each? Maybe here's just a random thought. Maybe a better way to think about it is, if you have an overarching liberal framework of the kind we're talking about, that's what you need as the superstructure for society, but it doesn't tell anyone how to live. And if that's all you have, there's no way to live, and you just kind of wander around the plane of existence wondering what to do, and maybe I'll eat popcorn or go shopping. It's a pretty empty existence. Whereas America, one of the great things about America was that we had a kind of assimilation where you could assimilate as much or as little as you wanted. And if you wanted to be the Amish and have a really thick moral community, you could do that. You could do that. Just go off into rural Pennsylvania, you can do that. And so I think it's not necessarily like a balance of left and right. It may be like a sort of liberal superstructure within which you can have very progressive enclaves in the cities full of artists who defy all norms. But most people don't want to live that way. And so you can construct all kinds of more conservative communities and progressive communities within that. That's kind of the way I remember the 20th century.
All right, so I think we are essentially out of time. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everybody, but I don't know how long you can stay to chat.
I'm coming to dinner.
Oh, good. So we'll all be able to chat at dinner. Thank you all.
Thank you.